goodness, my magic button actually worked correctly for once. Yes! Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Office Hours, the first of my regular summer office hours. I'm doing office hours Tuesdays, is it Wednesdays? Wednesdays and Thursdays. What day is today? Wednesdays and Thursdays for the next few months. I got a lot of nice openings in my schedule, and I was like, ooh, I should just totally pencil this in right here and now. B Squidward, Sir Chandwich, D Sanchez, good to see each of y'all. SQL Dev, DBA. I know now that it's like at a regularly scheduled time, I expect more of the kind of quote unquote regulars to tune in. If you're going to be a popular streamer, one of the things that they tell you is that you have to stream at the same days and times on a regular basis. Well, that would work a whole lot better if I had a normal kind of job with a predictable schedule. But as an emergency performance tuner, a lot of my work is unpredictable and weird. So a lot of my calendar tends to be last minute stuff. Sometimes I'm booked like 2-3 months in advance. Sometimes it's only like a week or two in advance. It all just depends on how many emergencies people are having. Right now I'm booked about 2 weeks in advance. So that I've got a bunch of stuff scattered out on my schedule for the coming months, but there's a lot of holes coming up. So it just worked out perfectly that I could do office hours on a regular schedule for a while. D. Sanchez says, missing your live classes. I don't know. Me personally, I'm not. I like not having to get up at a certain time, especially for the European audience. I was doing classes for the European audience, and so I would have to get up at 11 p.m. my time, sometimes even earlier, in order to be ready to be on camera live streaming for the European crowd, and that was just absolutely brutal. Good morning, Default Blame Acceptor, and Dan the SQL Man as well. So for today's, I'm just going to go through the PollGab queue. I'm going to go through the questions queue in PollGab. For the rest of the office hours, it's going to be a mix of things. Sometimes I'm going to be writing blog posts live. Sometimes I'll be working on the first responder kit. There's a couple of pull requests that are going to take a lot of work. I have to set up a test harness for SP database restore and for SP all night log. All night log. And I'm not really looking forward to those, so I figure if I incentivize myself by forcing myself to do it on camera, then it'll force me to go in and actually show you how I kind of fumble through things. I haven't used SP database restore or SP all night log in years because I just don't do as much production DBA work these days. Almost everything that I do is emergency performance tuning. So let's go see what's going on with the top rated question. So the top rated question is from Clippy, who asks, hey Brent, you're the best. Oh, that's very sweet of you. Can you share us more about your roots? What's the origin of your family name and where it comes from? I am not into genealogy at all. That's just not my bag in any way, shape, or form. But from what I understand of it, my ancestors, where the family name comes from, were Ukrainian, and that it used to be Ozark, but they dropped the K when they came to the United States. I've never seen anything in writing on that. That's just hearsay from a couple of my relatives. My grandma on my dad's side was very into genealogy. She was into all kinds of stuff, kept all kinds of records with that kind of thing. I just look at that as baggage. I think if you get that into your ancestors' nationalities and all that kind of thing, it tends to breed, us versus them. And I don't want to see myself as like being on one specific team. I'm a mutt. Sure, the name might come from Ukraine, but really there's pieces of me from all over. There's even some American Indian in me, as I understand it. Next up, I also want a Ferrari asks, hi Brent, first of all, thank you for all your good advice. You're welcome. During a batch, I can see a heavy CPU load. In perfmon, compiles are about 80% of my batch requests a second. Most of those compiles are coming from table-valued parameters. Is this a bad practice? So you got a bunch of things inside there. So let's start from the top. When you have high CPU usage, does it make sense to look at compiles? Yes, absolutely. Does it make sense to try to reduce those compiles? Yes, absolutely. Can TVPs be a cause of those compiles? Yes, absolutely. Are TVPs a bad practice? I don't know that I'd go that far. Let's just say that your compiles were coming from something else? Would we say that that's a bad practice? Nah, maybe you did that in order to solve some other problem. I don't really have a problem with TVPs, but if you want to learn more about the CPU overhead involved with them, go look at Michael J. Swart's blog. Michael J. Swart, S-W-A-R-T. Search for table valued parameters and compiles. And he has a blog post around whether or not, and I don't remember the takeaway on it because it's been like 5 years since I've read it. But he explains whether or not the compilations a second are a problem. Would I tell people not to use TVPs? Me personally, I would much rather have people create a temp table and then refer to that temp table inside the stored procedure. Then that way you can avoid compilations if you do it right. But if you do it wrong, you can also end up with the same compilations problem. The other thing I would ask is, do you really need the TVP? Because often I've popped open code with clients and I've been like, okay, so you got a table valued parameter here that takes a list of IDs. Do you ever actually send in more than one ID? And they're like, no, we did that as like a long-term design. Maybe someday, object-oriented code to be able to call it with multiple IDs, but we don't actually do that. Okay, great. Just rip out the TVP and just use a plain old parameter. Another way that you could solve that too is you could put in a string parameter, something like an nvarchar max or an nvarchar 4000, and you could pass in a comma delimited or whatever delimited list you like of values, and then use string split in order to reduce that. But that also comes with its own gotchas. Next up, this is a tricky one. Sid asks, is it better value for someone to go deep, like gather a whole bunch of knowledge, or go wide, like across a whole bunch of topics in their field? What common examples do you see of going deep and wide? Anybody who tells you they're deep and wide is most likely lying. They probably don't know a whole lot about a whole lot of technologies. Or if they think they do, they don't understand how deep that technology goes. I can think of a few exceptions. A lot of the people that I know who've worked at Stack Overflow over the years have gone very deep and very wide. Although I'll stop there. It's extremely rare to see, but you see it every now and then. Great examples are when you see like a DBA job posting for Stack Overflow, and they expect you to know everything from the network stack to the operating system to how disks work to how relational databases work to how C# calls it on the front end, and they expect you to know it in exhaustive detail. So those are the very, very rare cases where I've seen that. Most of the time, Buck Woody has a great line, and he always says it's not his, it's from somewhere else, but he says that in a mature product, go deep. In an immature product, go wide. What he means by that, for example, is right now, let's say that you want to work with AI technologies like LLMs, ChatGPT, any of those, to put in text and ask a question kind of thing. That market is changing so fast that it makes more sense to go wide, because if you go deep in any one of these, the churn on that product is going to be so quick that by the time you know it really well, the product has changed already. The only time it makes sense to go deep on something like that is when you work for the vendor itself. So in that immature market, you go wide and you learn a little bit about a whole lot of tools. If you're going to be a SQL Server DBA or an Azure SQL DB performance tuner, whatever you want to do there, it makes more sense to go much deeper and don't go as wide. I'm a great example of that. I'm deep on the relational engine, but I don't know jack as soon as you go off of that. I don't know how SSIS works, analysis services, reporting services. There are all kinds of things in the engine that I don't know how it works. Machine learning services, CLR code in the database. I could go on and on. Replication I haven't used in probably 10 or 15 years. So for me, I ended up going deep. If you're a consultant, There's a value in being wide because you can solve any problem with a wide variety of tools. You need me to move data around? Okay, I'll go grab Python and SSIS or Azure Data Factory. You want me to write a report on that data? Great, I'll go get Power BI and whatever else. So you know a little bit about a lot of things and you can cobble them together. You don't make crazy money at that. You're jack of all trades, make decent money, but not amazing money. If you want to be something like a heart surgeon, when the database's heart stops and you got to get it back online as soon as possible, that's where it generally pays to be a deep engineer and know that database forwards and backwards, because then you have very high value. They tend to get paid more. Redux World asks a question. For questions, go ahead and read the URL that's on the screen there, and that's where you can post your questions at. Next up, we have the Curious DBA asks, hi Brent, do you recommend manually configuring pagefile.sys? No. 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 If your SQL Server is swapping to disk, you have bigger problems. If your SQL Server is swapping to disk, it doesn't matter what disk it is. It doesn't matter how big the page file is. You are screwed. SQL Server should be the only thing inside the box. It should be the only thing running on that VM, so it should have plenty of memory available to breathe. If you find yourself installing lots of services on there, well, you're packing more clowns in the car, and you're going to run into performance problems, and the way you configure the page file ain't going to save you from that. Next up, we have Jamie, who asks, is there a good way to determine what % of the queries are single-threaded versus multi-threaded for the purposes of knowing if we have too many cores or licensing? You're going down the wrong path there. What you want to ask is, are we waiting on CPU? If we're not waiting on CPU, don't add more cores. And in fact, you could probably downsize those cores. But the percentage of single-threaded versus multi-threaded makes no difference, because what if you have 1,000 queries, they're all single-threaded, but they all hit at the same time? You need lots of cores to handle those. What if you only have one query running at a time and it happens to go multi-threaded? Do you want a lot of cores? Probably not. You probably want as few cores as possible because you're just wasting time there. So don't look at that percentage. You're going down the wrong path. Chris says there was a blog post I can't find now showing the magnitudes of differences between disk, RAM, whatever. You want the infinite space between words by Jeff Atwood. Jeff Atwood, aka Coding Horror, one of the founders of Stack Overflow, wrote a blog post called The Infinite Space Between Words that uses a chart from, what's Greg's last name? There's a Linux kernel performance tuner, Brendan Gregg. Uses a clip from his book to illustrate that point. Q says, hi Brent, how do you imagine life at your retirement? I assume for us it'll look like Brent Ozar Unlimited Last update 2 years ago. So for me, I like what I do enough that I don't think I'm ever going to retire in the traditional sense. I don't think there's going to be a point where I stick a fork in it and go, okay, I'm done working here. Over time, I've always evolved to do less of the work I don't like and more of the work that I do like. Examples of the work that I don't like is meetings. Years ago, I optimized my career so that I could sit in as few meetings as practically possible, that I could focus more on the tuning and the teaching people how to make things faster. So I would expect that for the foreseeable future, you'll still hear from me because I enjoy what I do. Like making fun of y'all. G Surgeon from the Netherlands asks, the Microsoft documentation on SET ARITHABORT for all versions states, setting ARITHABORT off can negatively impact query optimization, leading to performance issues. I have no idea whether that's true or not, and if you follow a lot of the blogosphere, often you'll see that there are plenty of examples where the documentation is wrong, so I would take that with a grain of salt. If there aren't examples inside the documentation supporting that statement, then I wouldn't take it as the gospel truth. And it may be true. I've never heard that particular thing, and I'm sure there are people who know more about it than me. He continues on. He says, why is that? Is the cardinality estimation so fragile? Oh my God, yes. Oh my God, yes. It's a miracle. Like as I go through my mastering classes and I do mastering query tuning, I try to emphasize to people, I'm amazed that SQL Server works as well as it does because the whole thing is a house of cards and the cards are made out of porcelain and there's a bull running around inside there knocking things over. I'm amazed at how good of a job SQL Server does on the vast majority of queries because you get people in there just hammering all kinds of crazy stuff on the keyboard that makes no sense, like set ARITHABORT off. I'm not really a fan of doing that, but you get people setting all kinds of crazy options that have been there for 25 years, mostly for compatibility purposes. So I'd like to say that generally the less dials and buttons that you touch, the better off you're going to be, and this is probably one of those examples. Next up, Yusuf asks, what are the best resources you've seen for Postgres performance tuning? I don't have anything for you. I got nothing. There was a point, so I basically took December of last year until February of this year, I took off. And during that time, all right, like a 3-month sabbatical, during that time, one of my goals was, what am I going to learn next? What is it that I want to teach people next? Do I want to continue working in SQL Server? Or do I want to switch to something else like Postgres, Visual Studio Code, Power BI, Azure Synapse Analytics? Did I want to go dive in something else? Because it's not like I feel like I've hit everything in SQL Server, but I feel like I've hit enough stuff that if you go through all my training courses, you'll do a pretty good job of conquering the engine and solving common performance problems and rare performance problems. So one of the things that I looked at was learning and training other people on Postgres performance tuning. I didn't find a lot of good resources out there, and part of me says that that means that the market is ripe for someone taking it over, is ripe for someone to be the Brent Ozar of Postgres. I just kind of ended up deciding it's not me. That's something that I don't really want to get into. I love Postgres. It's phenomenal. I just don't want to learn another database engine's performance tuning from scratch and then go teach it. I really kind of like SQL Server. I do expect to be doing more work in Azure SQL DB going forward because I think that that's still a ripe proving ground because performance tuning is very different on it too. The reason it's different is you can't trust anything to be there for you in the dynamic management views because Microsoft can and does fail these things over from time to time, restart them from patching, change their sizes dynamically, resets a bunch of the DMVs. And so it makes performance tuning much harder. I need to really step back and go, all right, for the year 2024 and beyond, how am I going to crack that nut and go from there? JP, for questions, check the link on the screen down there, and we upvote and take questions from there. Next up, the Dyslexic DAB asks, hi, Brent, we used to have a special SQL license. I think they mean pirated, which meant that it matter if we install enterprise or standard. I think maybe you mean it didn't matter. Boy, you really are dyslexic there. Our licensing has changed, and now we have dozens of enterprise editions that we can't afford. Any advice or gotcha from downgrading from enterprise to standard? So if you're on SQL Server 2016, make sure you're on Service Pack 2 or newer. Microsoft took a whole bunch of the features that developers wanted and they put them into Standard Edition instead of Enterprise in 2016 Service Pack 2. Since then, it hasn't mattered as much for developers whether you're on Standard or Enterprise. The other thing to think about is the number of CPU cores and the amount of memory that you have. Standard Edition maxes out at 24 cores and 128 gigs of RAM. Technically, it can go beyond that, but that's just a good starting point. It's fairly unusual for me to see boxes with more than 24 cores and 128 gigs of RAM that couldn't be downsized, that they just have all this extra horsepower sitting around. And the way that I often like to ask it to clients, is that I say, okay, look, here you're using 48 cores worth of CPU licensing. According to Microsoft, 48 cores times $7,000 a core, that's like $350,000 US. I'm not going to ask to see your licensing. I'm not the licensing police. I'm just going to ask a question. Would you like help reducing that exposure? And you can tell right away who's licensed and who's not, because the ones who are licensed are like, no, we're good there. We've already paid for it. We can't get a refund if we stop using it. Whereas the ones who haven't bought it are like, 350, is that in pesos or lira maybe, or something with rupees? And then they're like, yes, we would immediately like help. And then we go through and look at how much CPU headroom they have, and usually it's really easy to chop it down from there. If you want to know whether or not your server has headroom, check out the Mastering Server Tuning class. Very first module in the Mastering Server Tuning class talks about how to measure your SQL server. You don't have to attend the other mastering classes first when it comes to that one module. You can just jump straight into that one module, and it'll give you a feeling for whether your server is sitting around idle and it has some room to spare or not. All right, we've been going for a little while. Let's run an ad on Twitch. I'm going to take a short 90-second ad break, and then when we come back, we'll go into the newest questions, not the ones that have been highest upvoted, but the newest questions, which are likely to have come in from y'all. So see you back in here in 90 seconds. Where's the button to run an ad? I got to figure out where. I got to change that. Edit quick actions. No, I guess I can't. Let's try this button.